Hey, we're so close to completing the backend. Woohoo! The final change is to consume the valid transaction data method that we worked so hard to complete. So it's this big log one that enforces all the cryptocurrency rules for blockchain data. Ideally, we never want the chain to be replaced when the chain is found to have invalid transaction data. So head to the replace chain method in the blockchain/index.js file, which is right above. Let's add a new condition that checks the return Boolean value from calling valid transaction data on the incoming chain. If this is found to be false, well, we'll output an error that the incoming chain has invalid transaction data. So after our previous checks, we're going to have one more check that checks the value of valid transaction data when passing in the chain in an object. And then we're going to check in the case that this is false by using a bang operator. In this case, we'll return out of the replace chain functionality, like our other cases, to make sure we don't get to the line that replaces the actual chain. We'll also accompany with some error output that says the incoming chain has invalid transaction data. And conveniently, the actual error log is going to be logged within the valid transaction data method itself, thanks to whatever rule gets broken. So that way we know how the chain was actually malformed. All right, so with that, we've actually completed the overall backend. Pretty cool. The last thing we want to do is make sure that this change hasn't broken any existing behavior. And we can do that by running the overall test suite. So you'll find if you have the test suite running in the background that this does actually affect the replace chain code. Now let's investigate by going to the blockchain/index.test.js file. So this is quite a huge file now that we have all of these methods. But essentially, we want to check the replace chain method. And you'll notice that as we're calling blockchain.replaceChain, we're passing in the new chain.chain. When it comes to the new chain.chain, you'll find that we're adding blocks that don't necessarily consist of transactional data. So instead we have dummy data like bears, beats, Battlestar Galactica. Now, as fun as those blocks are, this won't pass the valid transaction data check because it's not an array of transactions. So immediately the valid transaction data check is going to fail or error out. So in this situation, we have two choices in order to address the issue. Option one is to refactor all the existing tests to actually use transaction data. And that seems like a nice option. Or option two, which is much less refactoring work. We're going to add a flag in the parameters of the replace chain method. If this flag is true, we're going to call valid transaction data. If false, we won't bother. So in the replace chain method, back in index.js, let's add a new flag before the onSuccess parameter called validate transactions. The reason we want this before the onSuccess parameter is that onSuccess and a callback is usually the last parameter to a method. It's a JavaScript convention, so let's maintain that convention. Now this allows us to only call this.validTransactionsData method if the validate transactions flag is actually true. So we're going to add a check here for if validate transactions. And if it's true, this AND statement will go to this.validTransactionData. If it's false, it won't bother running the second check over here. So this allows us to now block the this.validTransactionData method call with a validate transactions flag. Okay, as we save this should actually get the test to pass, and you're going to find that blockchain index.test.js is green just as before. Cool. Now it's a convenient approach for getting the test to stay green. Because the test never passed the validate transactions flag, well, it's always going to be undefined. And in JavaScript, undefined is treated as falsy when it comes to conditional operations. So in this case, the validate transactions method is never called. Nice. But now we need to make sure that this valid transactions data method is still called in the relevant places in our application code. And that is where the blockchain replace chain method is actually called. And that is within the pubsub.js file. We have this line to replace a chain with a new incoming message. And in this case, we certainly want to validate the transaction data. So we're going to pass in a flag of true as a new second argument to replace chain. All right, cool. So that should actually validate the transaction data during a run of the application. Finally, as the last thing, let's make sure that this new behavior is enforced through the test. So in blockchain/index.test.js, head to the replace chain method, and we're going to add a new describe block, which describes a situation where we have a case where the validate transactions flag is true. So that way we can enforce that the method of valid transactions data is actually called in this situation. All right, and then in this case now, it should call valid transaction data, the function itself. So let's have an init block that says it calls valid transaction data. And the idea with this is that we want to stub out the valid transaction data method. So let's make a constant of valid transaction data mock. And this is going to be set to our special jest.function. Okay, now we're going to reassign the valid transaction data method on the local blockchain instance to this valid transaction data mock. We'll say blockchain.valid transaction data is equal to this local valid transaction data mock. Now we're going to call blockchain.replace chain, and certainly as we pass in the new chain, we're going to pass in a flag of true to validate transactions. So that way, this valid transaction data method is actually called. And the final result is that we expect the valid transaction data mock to have been called. All right, now as we save this, we should probably expect the valid transaction data mock to have been called. But there's actually one catch with this, and perhaps you've already caught it, but notice that in the replace chain method, we already have existing validations. In the first one, we want the incoming chain to be longer. Now, in the context of this test, the new chain.chain hasn't gotten a chance to grow longer than the blockchain. So one thing that we need to make sure to do is add a block to the new chain that consists of some data, and this can be anything, because the idea is that, well, it doesn't need to have transaction data, because we want to make sure that valid transaction data mock is called in the first place. We don't really care about the return value, since we're testing all of that within this overall valid transaction data method and block of tests anyway. Now, as we save this, if you have an eye on the command line, you should find that the test suite passes for blockchain index.test.js, and now, well, everything is green. Cool. With that, the blockchain backend is actually complete. Congrats. So give yourself a huge pat on the back for making it this far. It was really quite a journey. With this hard work of the blockchain backend done, we can now move on to the front end. Whoop, whoop. So this is going to be especially fun. So far, we've been interacting with this blockchain through tests and making API requests. Now, that's certainly a thorough and effective way to do it, but adding a front end will make this blockchain feel, well, real. In the meantime, I encourage you to start up the application in dev mode. Open up Appear in the second tab. Explore the API through requests. Try a few transactions. Mine a block. Check if the chains are replaced. And once you're confident that everything is okay, go ahead and move on to the front end portion of the project. All right, see you there. It's going to be awesome.